G'day folks, thanks for tuning in. In today's video we're going to explore Object Source Lighting, or OSL, which is a technique we use to create local lighting effects on our miniature to make it more dramatic and visually interesting, and also help further tell the story. Today we'll be using this Demure wizard figure from Reaper Miniatures, which is an old metal mini from time forgotten. The spell in his right hand is a great candidate for OSL, as it's a single strong light source in a fixed position held off to one side. While your light source doesn't have to be on the mini to attempt OSL, or restricted to just one source, I find minis like this to be a great starting point. Thankfully, magic users holding spells and heroes holding torches are abundant in our hobby, so it shouldn't be too hard to find something similar regardless of your preferred game system. This mini was one of my first attempts at OSL, so I thought it would be fun to revisit. A previous attempt at this guy came out alright, but I want to try to improve upon it today. The flame is fairly bright and casting intense shadows, but I think the overall look is pretty dark and desaturated. Now this isn't necessarily a bad thing, and it looks quite dramatic and grimdark, but I wanted today to see if I can get a bit more vibrancy out of it. You'll also notice a decent amount of metal peeking through, particularly in the recesses. This comes from me varnishing him too soon after painting, as the paint that hasn't fully cured can shrink and peel away like this, especially on metal figures. I recommend waiting at least a week or two before varnishing, if you varnish at all, and have a video where I talk more about this and other troubleshooting that I'll link above. I recommend using a light primer for at least your light source, as we want to maximise our value. Any of your regular acrylic primers will work here, and I'll go on with a light grey from Vallejo. Our palette will be fairly focused, with titanium white, brilliant yellow pale, cadmium yellow medium, and cadmium red, mostly for our fire effects. I recommend true cadmiums here for opacity, or at least an artist grade imitation, but you could still get by with student grade with a bit more patience. Prussian blue and indigo will be for our robes and shadow colour, along with burnt umber, which we can use for browns or mix into the blues for blacks. I encourage focused palettes like this as it'll push you to embrace mixing your own colours, which will open a ton of doors for you along your painting journey. Now a quick word on fluorescents. They do exist in oils, like this one from Marion Street, and they can be a lot of fun for things like OSL. However, they can be hard to find and tend to be expensive, and are very transparent from the tube, so we won't be using them today just to keep things simple. This is another technique that newer painters may find intimidating, but I want to once again show you that oil paints make attempting it easy. So let's get started. We'll start with a large round synthetic brush to start blocking in our light. If you've seen my other videos, you'll be familiar with the pre-glaze or foundational layer, which we'll be more or less doing here. Most of this will be wiped away to leave us with a thin layer of stain that we can build on. That said, the flames themselves will likely stay as we block them in, as we're looking to preserve the intensity of those colours, and the goal is to not have to mess with them too much past those initial steps. I prefer to block in the light source first, as it'll give us a roadmap for the rest of the paint job. It'll also make preserving the purity of those colours easier than if we were to try to layer them on top of other paint later on. So in this vein we'll start with yellow, as it'll be much easier to transition out through orange and red as it would be to come back to yellow from another colour. When attempting OSL, I generally want to consider three things: the direction of the light, the intensity of the light, and the environment the light takes place within. Now this may all sound complicated, but don't worry, we're going to break it down as we go, relying on the properties of our oil paints to keep the process fluid and dynamic. The direction can easily be determined on minis like this by holding it up and looking at it from your light source. If it's in an awkward spot, then just eyeball it. Light will travel in a straight line and hit everything along that path. Don't worry about bounce lighting at this stage, we're just trying to get a sense of what it will and won't run into. So along the top of his sleeve, against the right side of his body that isn't blocked by his arm, and even the book held in front of him and the ground would all be hit by it. The extent of this will depend on the second consideration though, the intensity. How intense a light source is more up to us as artists. The more intense or brighter it is, the further that intensity you'll carry, and the stronger the cast shadows will be. So it's up to you to determine how much of a role you want your OSL to play in your piece. What is less up to us is that in order for it to look convincing, we need to consider the rules and the rate at which light will weaken or fall off the further it travels from the source. Now this follows the inverse square law, but rather than bust out the protractor, I just like to imagine a sphere around my light source, pick a rough distance, and make sure that I'm weakening that light significantly more at roughly equal intervals. So in this case the light will shift from white to yellow to orange to red, with the former colours occupying a much smaller area than the latter. Since oils are so good at blending, we can block this in progressively, adding red, then brown, applying it further and further away. Again, this may sound complicated, but I encourage you to just play with it. If it's not looking quite right, then remembering these rules will help you know where and how to refine it. Chances are your intuition's right, and the difference will just come down to that refinement. A third factor is the environment. Now this can be as simple as just asking whether your character is standing in a dark cave or out in the open, or as complicated as imagining multiple light sources, both on and off camera, of varying colours and intensities. In my previous attempt, the rest of the mini was dark and desaturated, which implied a poorly lit environment where the flame was overpowering. This time I want something a bit more balanced. It can be easy to think that everything else has to be dark compared to your OSL, but that isn't the case. While some contrast of value is absolutely needed to sell light, it doesn't have to extend to the entire mini, and we can block in the rest of our midtones away from the light like this. You'll notice as I blend out onto the arm that the blue is mixing with the orange, becoming much darker and less saturated, almost black. Here the oils are doing the work for us, as it's areas like this where we want the most contrast and value. While they're obscured from the light source, they're also closest to it, meaning the shadows there are going to be the strongest. Picking complementary colours like blue and orange are ways we can also use colour theory to get not only value and contrast, but colour and temperature too. We can continue sketching these shadows in, such as on the far side of the hat, to get a further sense of how our light will play out. Again, focusing these darker shadows along the back of objects that obstruct our light source. I realise this is a lot to throw at you at once, but as technical as this process is, it's also quite fluid in practice, especially with oils, and remember that nothing we do here is set in stone. For the rest of the mini, we're going to continue to block in our base tones, as well as apply some darkened umber to the base, making sure to use more thinner here so that the paint gets into all that texture. And we've already got a pretty solid sketch of our light source, the areas it'll illuminate, the shadows it'll cast, and the rest of our figure. So we'll let this sit for 10 to 15 minutes so those colours have a chance to stain, before coming in to wipe away that excess. So here we take a makeup sponge, ideally one cut to a size that we can be somewhat precise with, and, taking our light source into consideration, start wiping away the excess paint from the rest of the mini. This Prussian blue is a strong staining colour, meaning what's left behind will still have a lot of that colour in it, and by picking out the raised areas we can make a secondary value sketch for the parts more illuminated by that ambient light. We can also take away some of that OSL from the farthest reaches if we feel it's too intense there. While we're still left with the bright orange, the minimal paint left behind will make it easier to layer upon. With oils, less is always more, and an excess of paint can make both adhesion and visible brushstrokes more of a problem than they need to be. Again, you can see that light is made even stronger by the harsh shadows under the arm and the far side of the hat. This line of shadow helps further define the intensity of the light, but also its limits, freeing us up to do more with the rest of the mini. Just a few minutes in these two steps can be a great way to experiment with OSL, and if you just wanted to get a feel for it, you could even stop here. But we'll take things further and next look at establishing some initial highlights and details, and start to refine our lighting effect. We spent a lot more time than usual in our foundational layer, but in doing so we set ourselves up for success here. Most of our OSL is already blocked in, leaving us with much less of the mini to establish. Here I've decided that I don't care for the OSL to reach the base itself, so a bit of brilliant yellow pale lightly overbrushed will secure us some simple highlights on the dirt, and we can come back in with a bit of brown or even indigo if we wanted to re-establish some shadows. When it comes to highlighting the robes, I'm starting from his left side, working top to bottom with a bit of white mixed into that Prussian blue. By working from top to bottom, the blue on the mini will add to what's on our brush, getting us a nice subtle transition from light to dark as we move down. I'm not messing too much with the areas near the flame at this stage, as the goal is to establish the rest of the mini before coming back in to refine it, but I already feel like I've gone too light and too flat, so some Prussian blue back in will get us closer to that mid-tone. I've also painted the left side of the hat in this way, but I've left that line of shadow against the OSL. Again, this is to keep those elements separate, and to allow us to keep a relatively bright left side while not undermining the intensity of the flame. These shadow lines are small, but crucial in conveying that intensity. I'm also experimenting a bit with highlight placement in those areas close to the light, but still obstructed. As much as we're trying to avoid having to revisit areas, it's still worth playing around like this, as at the end of the day it won't take much to change up a highlight colour or two. Black and grey areas like the pants, shirt and beard can be easily made by mixing blue into brown, and then highlighted with either white or brilliant yellow pale. Notice that I'm keeping just a touch of that red on the right pant leg to maintain a bit of glow. A slight variation of that same colour will make the pages of our book. And some brown, red and yellow can be combined to make a bit of a skin tone. While much of the face is shielded from the flame by his floppy hat, if we overdo it, it'll be much easier to add back in that glow to those areas. For now, I'm just trying to restore a bit of value balance, as the beard has made that side of his face pop right out. By now, our unlit side is starting to look a lot more established than our lit, so our OSL is starting to look a little off in places, but we can use that information next as a guide to really dial it in. To refine the OSL, I'm going to start by adding some more orange and shrinking the yellow areas. As my glow isn't reaching all the way to the floor, I want to tighten things up a bit and keep more with the drop-off rule I mentioned in the beginning. This can be done by adding more shadows or highlights, keeping in line with our established direction and intensity. Picking out the fingertips is also a way to show a highly translucent material like skin being influenced by a light source that it's still technically blocking. So I mentioned earlier that on the flames we're going to progress from white, but you'll have noticed by now I haven't used any. Instead of brushing it on, we can heavily thin our paint and do a wash, and by touching it to the mini, that yellow and even white will fill the recesses, giving those deepest and brightest parts the most intensity. I go into washes in more detail in several of my other videos, so please check them out if you want to know more. We can then pick out the tips of the flames with our brand mix, even adding a bit of cheeky blue here and there for more contrast. Between the two, things are starting to look a whole lot hotter. From here it's a lot of back and forth, paying attention to the folds of the robes and our lines from the flame, just refining until we get something we're happy with. Now throughout this demonstration I'm trying to strike a balance between having a video that goes on for over an hour, while also avoiding a rest of the hour situation by showing you too little. If you'd like to see more, I keep extended real-time footage of this and many of my other videos over on my Patreon, which I'll link in the description. There you can also get early access to releases, vote on future content, and more, and it's a great way to further support the channel, which I really do appreciate. Another part of the environment I haven't mentioned yet are the materials. Different surfaces are going to interact with our light source differently. Heavy materials like I imagine his robes won't be as reflective or as translucent as his skin, and something like metal will be a lot more reflective than either. What this means is we can vary our highlight placement, value, and saturation to create even more interest. For example, his belt buckle, despite being in the deeper red drop-off zone, will catch more yellow highlight due to being both a hard edge and made of metal. While this is far from necessary to create a decent OSL effect, paying attention to these sort of details can really help elevate it, and once you're more comfortable with your light direction and intensity, I encourage you to start playing with your materials to help give things an extra kick. Finally, I'm just going to go around adding more highlights to the blue parts where I think they can do with it, and using selective washes to get a bit more separation and definition to parts that are running a little close together. We can also take a touch of that dark red and a dry round brush to touch to areas that we want to have just a little bit of that glow, such as the right edge of the book. Speaking of the book, I've also done a bit of cheeky scribbling on the pages and just knocked out his eyes to give him a little bit more character. And here he is, on his own and next to the last attempt. I'm much happier with how he's turned out this time, even though I was apprehensive about leaning into so much saturation in both the OSL and the rest of the Mini. While I do still love the grimdark look, it's always a good idea to try something different every now and again. I've certainly learned something here today, and I hope you have too. I've not varnished him this time and have since glazed a bit of that darker orange into his hat, as I felt it was a bit too strong after dialing the flames down a bit, but he's otherwise untouched and dry here. Now this is just a quick look at OSL. There's no limit to the colour, number or position of light sources you can incorporate into a Mini, and my main goal is to demonstrate both the basic concepts around light's direction, intensity and environment, and to show you how accessible oils make exploring those rules. I'm hoping this gives you more than a few ideas to try for yourself. So thank you very much for spending time with me here today, and a special thanks to all of my Patreon supporters who make these kind of videos possible, including those whose names are on the screen. If you have any questions about any of the products or techniques I've talked about today, or a topic you'd like me to cover in a future video, I'd love to hear it. Again, thanks very much for being here, and take care.